In June of 1821, an old man sat down at a desk in Virginia and wrote a letter about vanilla. He was 78. He had written the Declaration of Independence, served 2 terms as President of the United States, and was at that moment building a university. He was also, by any measure of his time, a wealthy man living in one of the finest houses in America. And he could not get vanilla. So he wrote to a friend with business in Philadelphia. He explained that the vanilla bean was much used in seasoning ice creams, that he remembered being able to buy it easily when he lived in that city, and that the beans came packed in small, flat tin boxes. Boxes small enough, he pointed out, that if you wrapped one in coarse linen and then in paper, you could address it like a letter and send it through the mail. He folded a $10 bill into the letter and asked the man to please find him a box. Read that again. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, twice President of the United States, is mailing cash to a friend in another city, hoping somebody can track down a tin of vanilla beans and post it to him like a parcel of correspondence. 200 years later, the United States is the largest consumer of vanilla flavor on the planet. It is in the ice cream, the cake mix, the coffee creamer, the protein powder, the candle burning in the next room. It costs almost nothing. And in American English, vanilla has become an adjective. It means plain, ordinary, the safe choice, the flavor you pick when you don't care enough to pick.
Honey or clusters?
How does that happen? How does a thing so scarce that a president has to write letters about it become the word we use for nothing special at all? The answer runs through Mexican rainforests, Spanish treasure fleets, English apothecaries, a barren greenhouse at Kew, a German pine forest, a cyclone, and a 12-year-old enslaved boy who solved in a few seconds a problem that had defeated European science for 3 centuries, and who died with nothing. There's one more thing worth holding on to before we start. The man writing that letter in 1821 owned people. Over his lifetime, he enslaved more than 600 human beings, and he wrote about liberty while doing it. 20 years after he mailed that $10 bill, on an island on the other side of the world, an enslaved child made vanilla cheap enough that every American would eventually have it in the cupboard. He was never paid. He was never freed for it. The law freed him 7 years later, along with everyone else. That's not a coincidence I'm reaching for. It's the actual shape of this story. Every step in the making of this flavor was taken by someone who didn't get to keep it. But the story doesn't begin in Virginia. It begins tens of millions of years earlier, in the hot, wet forests along the Gulf of Mexico, with a plant that, if we're honest about it, should never have become food at all. Because vanilla is not a fruit or a grain or a root. It's an orchid, and almost everything about it is arranged to make human life difficult. The orchid family is the largest family of flowering plants on Earth, over 20,000 species, and by some counts a good deal more. Orchids grow in the tropics and on the tundra, on trees and on bare rock. They look like insects, like birds, like open mouths. And out of all those thousands of species, human beings eat the fruit of exactly one genus, vanilla. In practice, the entire world market rests on a single species, Vanilla planifolia. That vast family gives us beauty and nothing else. And even this one edible genus behaves as though it wants nothing to do with us. Vanilla is a vine. It needs a tree to climb, sometimes 10 or 15 meters of it. It will not flower until its 3rd or 4th year. The flower opens for a single morning. By noon, it is wilted and dropped. One flower, one morning, one chance a year. And inside the flower, there's a trap. The male and female parts sit millimeters apart, but between them stretches a thin membrane called the rostellum, which physically prevents the plant from pollinating itself. In its native forest, a few insects manage to get past that barrier, and even then, only a small fraction of flowers ever set fruit. And now the part that matters most. Even when the pod grows, ripens, and is cut, it does not smell at all. A freshly picked green vanilla pod has no aroma and no taste. Everything the world loses its mind over appears afterward through a long process invented by human beings. The pod is killed, forced to sweat, dried, and then left to rest for months while enzymes inside break compounds apart and release vanillin along with more than 250 other aromatic substances. Hold on to that detail. It explains everything that follows. Vanilla is not found. Vanilla is manufactured. This flavor does not exist ready-made in nature. It is the product of human technology, from the first step to the last, from pollination by thumb to months of fermentation. It isn't food somebody picked up off the ground. It's a flavor somebody built. And they built it as a chord, not a note. When we say the smell of vanilla, we usually mean one substance, vanillin. But in a properly cured pod, chemists count more than 250 volatile compounds, and they work together. Vanillin supplies the recognizable sweet center. Around it sit woody, smoky, floral, faintly sour, almost leathery notes you couldn't name individually, but without which the flavor goes flat. Remember that contrast, the chord and the single note. The entire second half of this story is about how humanity learned to reproduce the note and decided it didn't need the chord. The people who built the chord first were the Totonacs. The coast of what is now the Mexican state of Veracruz, hot, wet lowlands facing the Gulf. Here, around the town of Papantla, live the Totonac people, the same people who raised El Tajín and its pyramid covered in stone niches. They are credited with the first domestication of the vanilla orchid, and they have a story about where it came from that is not remotely a cooking story. A ruler's daughter, so beautiful that her father decided no man was worthy of her, was consecrated to a temple. She fell in love anyway. She and her lover ran. They were caught and killed. And where their blood entered the ground, a vine rose up, wrapped itself around the trees, and filled the air with a perfume nobody there had known before. Notice that even in its own origin story, vanilla is born from an execution rather than from abundance. The Totonacs used it in ritual, in incense, in medicine, ground pod for complaints of the stomach and chest, the liquid of the green pod to draw venom from bites and to dress wounds. And it was here, in these forests, that someone whose name we will never know first worked out that a green pod is not to be eaten, but tormented, put in the sun, covered with cloth, made to sweat, dried again. The first vanilla curing technologist in the history of the world left no name. He left a method the world still uses. That method deserves a proper look, because it's the thing that turns a plant into a spice. A cut pod is alive. The substances of the future aroma are already inside it, bound up in other molecules, but as long as the cells keep working normally, nothing will happen. The pod will simply dry out like grass. So the first thing you do is kill it. In modern production, the pods go into hot water, around 65 degrees Celsius, for a few minutes. In the older Mexican practice, they were held on the bare sun or baked in covered earth pits. The cells rupture, and a different kind of life begins inside the pod. Enzymes reach molecules they previously couldn't touch and start stripping sugars off them, releasing vanillin. The second stage is sweating. The hot pods are wrapped in wool or heavy cloth, stacked in boxes, and kept that way for weeks. By day, they're brought out into the sun. By evening, they're bundled up again. Inside, there's greenhouse heat and the pod's own moisture. It darkens, shrinks, turns oily, and for the first time begins to smell. The third stage is slow drying, several weeks in shade, so the pod gives up water without going brittle. And then the fourth, the least obvious one. The pods are tied into bundles, put into closed boxes, and simply left. For months, sometimes half a year. In the dark and quiet, the aroma finishes maturing, the way a spirit matures in a barrel. From the flower that opened for one morning to a pod fit to sell is more than a year. None of those 4 steps can be skipped or hurried without losing quality. This is not a harvest. This is manufacturing spread across seasons, and it was invented barefoot, without thermometers and without chemistry, centuries before anyone in Europe had the word enzyme. And then an empire came for the smell. In the 1480s, the Aztecs conquered Totonacapan, the land of the Totonacs. They wanted vanilla badly, for a very simple reason. In the dry highlands around their capital, the vine would not grow. The only way to have it was to take it from people who knew how to grow it. So vanilla became tribute. They called it tli-chochil in Nahuatl. That's usually translated black flower, though black pod would be closer. The flower is a pale, almost white yellow, and it's the dried fruit that goes black. That confusion outlived the empire and misled Europeans for centuries, who kept expecting a dark blossom. In the Florentine Codex, compiled from Nahua informants, vanilla is described soberly and admiringly at once. A vine that creeps and creeps, that sends out shoots, that makes a pod. A precious thing, fragrant, good in drink, and good as medicine. The drink is the heart of it. Aztec nobility drank a thick, cold, whipped preparation of ground cacao with chili and vanilla. It was not sweet, it was bitter and spiced, and it was reserved for rulers, priests, and warriors. Vanilla did in it exactly what it still does in every pastry kitchen on the planet. It turned bitterness into depth instead of harshness. And here, vanilla stops being food and becomes an instrument of power. Cured pods sit in the imperial storehouse next to jade and quetzal feathers. They flow to the capital from a conquered province, and the person entitled to drink them is not the person who grew them, but the person who won the war. Meanwhile, ships were already approaching that same coast, ships after which neither the Aztecs nor their monopoly would remain. 1519. Hernan Cortés lands on the coast of Veracruz, precisely where vanilla grows, and marches inland. In Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma receives him with a feast, and at that feast the Spaniards are served that drink. Cold, whipped to a foam, bitter, in vessels that impress the guests as much as the contents. The Spaniards tasted it and did not understand what they were tasting. They remembered the cacao. Only later, taking the recipe apart, did they discover that the depth and the perfume came not from the bean, but from a black, wrinkled pod the locals threw in alongside it. 2 years later, the Aztec Empire had ceased to exist. Cortés sent both cacao and vanilla back to Spain, and so began the thing that would define the next 300 years. A flavor that belonged entirely to one people and one stretch of coast became a colonial commodity. A strange one at that. For nearly a century, Europeans didn't consider vanilla a product in its own right at all. It crossed the Atlantic for exactly one purpose: to be put into chocolate. It was the seasoning of a seasoning. In Seville, they gave the pods a name, and the name is a small story by itself. The Spanish called them vainilla, a diminutive of vaina, sheath, pod, casing. And vaina came from the Latin vagina, meaning precisely the same thing: the sheath of a sword, which means the word now printed on every second yogurt and every second scented candle in the world literally means little sheaths. It was named after the shape of the fruit, with no poetry whatsoever. And it's that blunt practicality that outlived both the Aztecs and the Spanish Empire. The person who first broke the chain of vanilla equals chocolate had nothing to do with cooking. Around 1602, Hugh Morren, apothecary to Queen Elizabeth I, proposed using vanilla on its own, as a flavoring in its own right, rather than an additive to cacao. The idea was unobvious enough that it earned a permanent place in the record. This is the moment vanilla stops being part of somebody else's recipe and becomes its own flavor. That's an English contribution, and it's worth pausing on, because England's relationship with this plant is going to be a comedy of failure for the next 240 years. After Morren, the logic of the courts took over. An aroma that costs a fortune, that only a few people can get, and that comes from the other side of the world, is a perfect status marker. Vanilla went into sweets, into drinks, into perfume, into medicine, and, like nearly everything rare and fragrant in that era, it immediately acquired a reputation as an aphrodisiac. 18th century physicians wrote quite seriously about its power to restore male vigor and cited dozens of cured patients. Medical value, 0. Explanatory value, enormous, because it tells you why demand grew faster than supply ever could. And all that demand pointed at one place on the map: Papantla, Veracruz, the town Mexicans still call the city that perfumed the world. Here, Totonac families gathered the vine from the forest and trained it up trees. Here the pods were laid in the sun and covered. Here they were tied into bundles and sent to the port. And from here, through the whole 18th century and most of the 19th, vanilla went out to the entire planet. Europeans naturally had no intention of tolerating this. The colonial playbook was simple and well rehearsed. Take the plant, cut some slips, plant it in your own tropical colony, crash the price, keep the margin. It had worked on sugar cane, on coffee, on rubber, on the cinchona tree. It would be done to vanilla. And here, everything fell apart. The cuttings went out. The vines took. In the greenhouses of Europe and on the islands of the colonies, vanilla grew magnificently. Vigorous, healthy, green. It even flowered. Every year it obediently opened its pale blossoms. And every year the flowers dropped without leaving anything behind. Not one pod. Not in Paris, not in London, not in Java, not in the Indian Ocean. At Kew, outside London, vanilla vines grew and flowered for decades as an expensive botanical curiosity with no practical use whatsoever. The Dutch took cuttings to Java. The French took them to Bourbon, the island we now call Réunion, in 1821, the same year as that letter from Virginia. The vine took root there, and it went 20 years without fruiting. Same on Mauritius. Same everywhere. Picture the economics of that absurdity. Entire colonial administrations maintaining for years plantations of a plant that physically could not produce a product. Land cleared, labor driven, reports filed, and every season, nothing. The Totonacs, hearing of these failures, called it Moctezuma's curse. European botanists looked for the cause in the soil, in the water, in the altitude. The real cause was far more prosaic and far more humiliating. In its native forests, the flower was opened by an insect adapted to it over millions of years of shared evolution. No insect on any other island on Earth knew how to do that, and none had the slightest reason to learn. Which insect, incidentally, is still not settled. And that's another irony. In the popular telling, the answer is confident. The Mexican Melipona bee, small and stingless. That version spread through books, labels, and museum cards until it became a fact by default. But recent work points instead to large, metallic-sheened bees of a different group, the euglossines, whose males collect aromatic compounds from orchids. There's evidence for hummingbirds, too, and solid data that under natural conditions, only a tiny percentage of flowers ever set fruit. Which is to say, today, with vanilla farmed on 4 continents and traded in the billions, we still cannot name with certainty the creature this flower evolved for. Now let's go back to that letter, because by now you can see why the man writing it was stuck. In 1821, there was exactly one place on Earth producing vanilla, and it was not producing very much of it. The pods that reached Philadelphia had come up from Veracruz through a trading system built by a foreign empire, and they arrived irregularly. There was no American vanilla industry, because there could not be one. There was no Indian Ocean supply because the vines there were sterile. The entire global stock passed through one Mexican region and whatever ships happened to be sailing. So Jefferson, enclosing $10 and hoping a friend could find a tin box, was not eccentricity. It was an accurate description of the supply chain. He'd developed the taste in France, where he'd spent 5 years as America's minister. He came home with a French butler trained in frozen desserts, and, in the same period, he wrote out a recipe for ice cream in his own hand. It survives. It's held at the Library of Congress. It is the earliest known ice cream recipe recorded by an American. He didn't invent American ice cream, and he didn't introduce it. But he wrote it down, he served it at the president's house, and guests wrote home about it. So here is the shape of American vanilla at the start. A flavor learned in Europe, sourced from Mexico through Spanish channels, prepared by enslaved cooks in a Virginia kitchen, and eaten by a handful of people at the very top of the country. 200 years later, it's the default flavor of a nation of 330 million. Everything in between is the story of how the price collapsed. The first crack came from science. In the late 1830s, the Belgian botanist Charles Morren, a professor at the University of Liège, took the flower seriously and did what nobody had done. He took its anatomy apart and understood exactly where the failure was. He saw the membrane. He grasped that the two parts of the flower had to be joined by hand, bypassing the barrier. And he did it. He got fruit by artificial pollination and published the method. The problem was solved. The problem remained. Because Morren's method was scientific, not industrial, it required time, care, instruments, and an understanding of floral structure. For one vine in a greenhouse, excellent. For a plantation where you must get around thousands of flowers in a single morning, each open for only a few hours, useless. The arithmetic didn't work. Botanists proved vanilla could be pollinated. They did not prove anyone could make a living from it. That proof came from the other end of the world, from the last person anyone expected. Réunion, still called Bourbon then, the plantation of Ferriol-Bellier-Beaumont at Sainte-Suzanne. A boy named Edmond, born around 1829, enslaved. His mother died giving birth to him. He never knew his father. His owner, a man genuinely obsessed with plants, took him into the garden and began teaching him, not reading, but botany. How a flower is built, how to move pollen from the male part to the female part. On squash and melons that had been done by hand for a long time, there was no mystery in it. And then came the thing that took a full century to admit. A child with no schooling, no books, and no access to any scientific correspondence took a principle he'd been shown on a vegetable patch and applied it to an orchid. He looked at the flower. He found the membrane. And he invented not a scientific method, but a working gesture. A thin sliver lifts the rostellum. The thumb presses the anther against the stigma. The whole movement takes 2 or 3 seconds and repeats forever. The French still call it le geste d'Edmond, Edmond's gesture. One morning in Bellier-Beaumont walked out into his garden and saw, on a vine he had tended for more than 20 years and which had never produced a single fruit, 2 green pods. He didn't believe the boy. He asked to be shown. Edmond showed him. A few days later, another pod set, then another. The difference between Morren and Edmond is the difference between a discovery and an industry. The Belgian professor's method worked in a laboratory. The enslaved boy's method worked in a field, at speed, in the hands of people nobody had taught any botany at all. That is precisely why his, and not the professor's, changed the world. Bellier-Beaumont understood what he had and acted with commercial coldness. He began taking the boy from plantation to plantation so he could teach the gesture to other enslaved people. Within a few years, the island that had spent 2 decades unable to produce a single pod was exporting vanilla by the ton. And here the story stops being about botany and becomes a story about who is permitted to be an author. Edmond received his freedom in 1560 when France abolished slavery. He was about 19. Along with freedom, he received a surname, Albius, from the Latin for white, after the color of the vanilla flower. No share of the industry he had created was owed to him. He went to the city and took work as a kitchen servant. At the same time, the one thing he did have was being taken away: authorship. The French botanist Jean-Michel Claude Richard announced that he had discovered hand pollination himself 3 or 4 years earlier, and that the boy had simply watched him do it. The claim was convenient, and for many people, welcome. The scientific community found it easier to accept that the method belonged to a white specialist than to an uneducated black child. His former owner fought it. Bellier Beaumont wrote to historians and to the local press and dismantled Richard's version with simple arithmetic and simple logic. To have taught the boy in 1838, you would have had to instruct an 8-year-old. And above all, why would a botanist who had made a discovery of that magnitude keep it from every colleague and planter he knew and share it with one child? What came next was worse. In the early 1850s, Albius was convicted for involvement in a theft whose circumstances have not reached us intact. He received a heavy sentence and served part of it at hard labor until petitions from his former owner secured a commutation. Bellier Beaumont wrote that if anyone on that island had a claim to clemency and to recognition, it was Edmond, because the colony owed him an entire branch of its economy. He was released. He was never compensated. Edmond Albius died on the 9th of August, 1880, at St. Suzanne, in poverty, aged about 51. By then, his gesture was feeding the island, and within decades, it would feed whole countries. The street, the school, and the statue came much later. The first memorial plaque in his hometown wasn't put up until 1980, exactly 100 years after his death. 100 years. That's what it took to hang a plaque. The industry, meanwhile, took off. Reunions surged. What began as tens of kilograms was being counted in the hundreds of tons by the end of the century. That's where the trade name you still see on jars comes from. Bourbon Vanilla. It has nothing to do with the whiskey. It's simply the island's old name. From there, Edmond's gesture traveled the map. Cuttings and technique reached Madagascar, the Comoros, the Seychelles, the Dutch East Indies. In Polynesia, a different species took hold, Vanilla tahitensis, with a more floral, almost aniseed character. By the 20th century, the center of gravity had moved decisively to Madagascar and the northeastern Sava region. Sambava, Antalaha, Vohemar, and Dapa became the vanilla capital of the world. Mexico, which had commanded this flavor for 3 centuries, lost its monopoly within a generation. And the thing that replaced it has to be named honestly. The Indian Ocean vanilla industry did not grow only on good agronomy. It grew on the plantation system. Edmond's technique spread through the hands of enslaved people, and after abolition through the hands of indentured workers brought from far away on terms that differed from slavery more in paperwork than in substance. In 1896, France converted Madagascar into a colony outright, and the vanilla estates became part of a colonial economy with everything that entailed: forced labor, taxes payable only in work, and total dependence on a purchase price set by somebody at the port. Vanilla isn't expensive because it's rare. Vanilla is expensive because it devours labor. 3 years of waiting for the first flower. 1 morning to pollinate each flower. 9 months for the pod to mature. Months of curing. By industry estimates, a single kilogram of pure vanillin requires on the order of half a ton of pods. That is, tens of thousands of flowers pollinated one at a time, by hand, with one movement of a thumb each. And at the exact moment that monstrous labor load became the basis of a global business, a laboratory on the other side of the world stripped it of its value. Germany, the early 1870s. A young chemist named Wilhelm Harman was working with a substance isolated from the sap of conifers, coniferin. It smelled of vanilla, and the idea of synthesizing a natural aroma took hold of him. Together with his colleague, Ferdinand Tiemann, he established the structure of vanillin, vanilla's principal aromatic compound, and found a way to make it from pine bark and sap. On the 10th of April, 1874, the synthesis of vanillin was patented. In Holzminden, a small town in Lower Saxony surrounded by conifer forest, Harman's vanillin factory opened. It would later be called Harman and Reimer, and today it is part of the Symrise Group, one of the world's giants of flavors and fragrances. Industry historians call that date the birthday of the entire global flavor and fragrance business. It isn't an exaggeration. Before 1874, flavor was an agricultural product. After 1874, flavor was a chemical product. Sit with what just happened. The Aroma an empire conquered a coastline for, that ships crossed the Atlantic for, that a 12-year-old pollinated flowers by hand for, turned out to be, essentially, a single molecule. And that molecule could now be assembled out of pine bark. From there, chemistry only got cheaper. Coniferin was in short supply and was soon replaced by eugenol from clove oil. Then came the guaiacol root. In the 1930s, production shifted to lignin, a waste product of the pulp and paper industry, literally the sludge left over from cooking wood into paper. Vanillin began to be made out of what had previously been poured away. Here's where it stands today. World vanillin consumption is measured in tens of thousands of tons a year. The overwhelming majority, on the order of 85%, is synthesized from petrochemical guaiacol. Roughly 15% comes from lignin, that paper mill residue. And actual orchid pods account for a share the industry reviews measure in fractions of a percent, a few dozen tons against tens of thousands. Synthetic vanillin costs something like $15 a kilogram. Natural vanillin costs hundreds, and in peak years, thousands. The difference isn't 100-fold. It's several orders of magnitude. There it is, the refrain of this whole story in its purest form. The flavor the Aztecs collected as tribute, that was paid for in silver, that one man received not a franc of credit for, is now made from paper mill waste and costs less than most of the spices in your cupboard. And cheapness is what made vanilla ubiquitous, nowhere more completely than in the United States. The American 20th century runs on vanillin. Ice cream and chocolate between them consume the lion's share of world production. It's in the baking, the sodas, the yogurts, the cookies, the coffee. It's in perfume, where from the late 19th century onward, perfumers discovered that a synthetic vanilla note gave a composition a warm, sweet trail that previously required expensive resins. It's in tobacco, in medicines where it masks bitterness, in animal feed, in household cleaners. And vanilla ice cream became something close to a national default. Survey after survey of American ice cream preferences puts plain vanilla at or near the top, not because it's anyone's passion, but because it's the flavor nobody objects to. It's the base of the sundae, the scoop on the pie, the thing you buy for a household that hasn't agreed on anything. Which is how the language changed. Somewhere in the 20th century, vanilla stopped being a noun and became an adjective. It came to mean plain, standard, unadventurous, without extras. And that is the single cruelest turn in this entire history. A flavor made of more than 250 aromatic compounds, one of the most chemically complex flavors known to us, became the English word for having no character at all. It isn't a story about a plant. It's a story about what happens to anything human beings learn to make infinitely. Value rests on scarcity, not on complexity. Remove the scarcity, and complexity will not save you. There is one more American twist, and it's the reason your bottle says what it says. By the mid-20th century, the gap between real extract and cheap imitation had become a commercial free-for-all. Long before the chemists, pods had simply been adulterated, soaked to add weight, rubbed for shine, padded out with worthless species. But the most widespread fraud of the 19th and early 20th centuries was more elegant. Instead of vanilla, manufacturers added coumarin, a compound from the tonka bean, the seed of a South American tree. Coumarin smells warm and sweet, somewhere between vanilla and fresh-cut hay, and cheap vanilla essences were full of it. It's sold as vanilla, cost almost nothing, and satisfied most people. The problem emerged later. Coumarin turned out to be toxic to the liver with regular consumption. In 1954, the American regulator banned it from food, and an entire adulteration industry collapsed, ceding the ground to synthetic vanillin, which was cheaper and safer anyway. But banning a fake doesn't define the real thing. So the United States did something it has done for remarkably few foods. It wrote vanilla into federal law. Under the standard of identity in the Code of Federal Regulations, vanilla extract is not a marketing phrase. It is a legal specification. To be sold under that name in the United States, a product must be a solution in aqueous ethyl alcohol of the flavor principles extractable from vanilla beans. It must contain not less than 35% ethyl alcohol by volume, and it must contain not less than 1 unit of vanilla constituent per gallon, where a unit is defined as 13 and 35 ounces of vanilla beans at 25% moisture. Under 35% alcohol, and it can no longer be called extract. It has to be labeled vanilla flavoring. Double the beans, and you may call it twofold. The regulation even specifies which orchid species count. Read that again, and notice how strange it is. The federal government of the United States has written down, to the fraction of an ounce, how much orchid fruit must go into a gallon of liquid before you are allowed to call it vanilla. There is no comparable federal specification for most flavors. Vanilla is essentially alone in this. Why? Because vanilla is the one flavor where the incentive to lie has always been overwhelming. When the genuine article costs several hundred times the imitation, and the two smell broadly alike, the market cannot police itself. So the law had to define reality, which gives you, right now, a practical tool. Turn the bottle around. Pure vanilla extract is a legally constrained claim. Vanilla flavoring means it didn't clear the alcohol threshold. Imitation vanilla, or an ingredient list naming vanillin, means you are holding the molecule, not the pod. And natural flavor, we'll come back to that one, because it is doing more work than you think. Because the real thing has never gone away, and roughly once a decade it reminds the entire global food industry that it exists. On the 7th of March 2017, Cyclone Enawo struck northeastern Madagascar. the strongest storm in 13 years, equivalent to a Category 4 hurricane. It came ashore directly across the Sava region, the exact center of world vanilla production. Dozens of people died, and tens of thousands lost their homes. Vines were torn from their support trees. Early estimates from the ground put crop destruction around Antalaha as high as 90%. Madagascar was supplying roughly 80% of the world's natural vanilla. The market reacted instantly and without mercy. The price, which had been in the tens of dollars per kilo at the start of the decade, blew past $600. In individual deals, it reached $750. There was a stretch in which a kilogram of vanilla pods cost more than a kilogram of silver. Ice cream shops in Europe and the United States pulled vanilla from the menu because they couldn't afford it. Vanilla ice cream, the very thing that had become the symbol of the unremarkable, turned back into a luxury. Now look at what that price explosion did to the people who'd grow it. A pod on the vine became worth as much as jewelry, and the village around it remained among the poorest places on earth. Thieves arrived, not petty ones, organized at night with sacks. They cut pods, hacked through vines, carried off a family's annual income in a single night. Farmers stopped sleeping at home and moved into their own plots, spending nights in the bush with homemade weapons, guarding the rows. Police and village patrols detained thieves by the hundreds. In some cases, those caught were beaten to death on the spot without waiting for any court. And then the mechanism kicked in that kills the product more surely than any cyclone. Fearing theft, growers began picking the pods green long before time. But it's precisely the final months on the vine that create the aroma. An unripe pod looks identical and has no flavor in it. The market filled with vanilla that looks like vanilla and doesn't smell like vanilla. Quality collapsed, buyers began refusing, the price fell through the floor. Some farmers tore out their vines in disgust, and a few years later the shortage began all over again. That's how this industry works now, a seesaw between $600 and nearly nothing. And at both ends of the seesaw, the same person loses. Now, who put that seesaw in motion? This is where an American thread runs straight back into a Madagascan village, and it's uncomfortable. Through the 2010s, a wave of pledges swept the American and European food industry. Manufacturers announced they were removing artificial flavors and colors from their products, moving to what the trade calls clean label. Consumers had asked for it, loudly and reasonably. Nobody wants a list of chemicals in their child's cereal. But when several of the largest food manufacturers on Earth simultaneously commit to natural vanilla, demand for actual pods spikes overnight, and supply cannot answer. A vanilla vine yields its first crop 3 to 4 years after planting, and no amount of money shortens that. The consumer's good intention, multiplied by the biology of an orchid, produced a price explosion that then landed on the heads of the very farmers the intention was supposed to help. There's an older and blunter example of the same asymmetry. The largest soft drink company on the planet replaced its flagship formula. The episode is remembered as one of the great marketing failures in history. The public revolted, and the original was back on shelves within about 3 months. But while America argued about soda, Madagascar, which supplied that same company, absorbed a shock to one of its principal export earnings. Think about what that means. A decision about the taste of a drink made in a boardroom in another hemisphere determines how much money arrives in a village where nobody drinks it. The grower in Saba cannot influence that decision, cannot learn about it in advance, and cannot hedge against it. His vines were planted 3 years ago, and there is nothing else to convert them into. That is the actual engine of the modern vanilla economy. Not the Cyclone, and not the thieves. The total asymmetry between the people who grow it and the people who decide. So let's look coldly at where everyone stands today. At the bottom, tens of thousands of small holdings in Madagascar and their counterparts in Indonesia, Uganda, Papua New Guinea, and Mexico. People who pollinate flowers with Edmond's gesture, wait 9 months, cure pods for months more, and sell them to a buyer who rode into the village on a motorbike. By estimates cited at the height of the boom, the farmer's share of the export price was in the low single-digit percentages. Everything else stays with middlemen, exporters, and processors. At the top, a handful of global flavor and fragrance houses. They, not the ice cream makers, buy most of the world's vanilla and decide what it's worth. One large Swiss player alone buys on the order of 300 tons a year, more than 1/10 of global supply. And among these companies sits the direct heir of that vanillin factory in Holzminden, founded in 1874. The circle closes. The firm that made vanilla unnecessary is now one of its principal buyers. Then there's the label, and here's where we come back to natural flavor. The word natural on a package does not mean from the orchid. Since the early 2000s, vanillin has been produced biotechnologically. Microorganisms convert ferulic acid from rice bran or other plant material, and out comes the identical molecule. Under the law of a number of countries, that vanillin may be called a natural flavor because it was obtained by a biological route from plant material. It is far cheaper than pods and has no connection to the orchid whatsoever. And this isn't a loophole invented by crooks. It's a rule working exactly as written, which simply doesn't match what the buyer hears. The regulator means by natural the method of production. If a living organism assembled a molecule rather than a flask, it's natural. The buyer means by natural the origin. If it says vanilla, there was vanilla. An entire industry fits between those two definitions. Note the contrast with the extract standard we just walked through. American law defines pure vanilla extract with surgical precision down to ounces per gallon and leaves natural flavor almost wide open. One phrase on a bottle is a legal specification. The phrase right next to it is nearly a mood. There's one more thing that gets discussed less. Hand pollination is fine, patient work, and in season the whole family does it, children included. International organizations have documented child labor in vanilla growing districts for years. That the technique was invented by a 12-year-old who was never paid for it stops sounding like a historical curiosity almost 2 centuries later. And the price seesaw carries a cost nobody human pays. Northeastern Madagascar holds one of the most singular biological communities on the planet. Almost nothing that lives there lives anywhere else. When the price climbs, money and people arrive, and hillsides are cleared for new plantings. When it collapses, a farmer with no income goes into the forest for whatever can be sold or eaten. In both directions of the seesaw, pressure on what remains of the rainforest increases. Ecologists working in Sava have been describing that chain for years. A spike in the world price of a dessert becomes felling on the other side of the earth. So the power over this flavor hasn't gone anywhere. It has only moved house. Once it belonged to an Aztec ruler collecting pods as tribute, then to a Spanish crown controlling the only port, then to a colonial administration setting the purchase price. Now it lives in the contracts of a few companies and in the small print on the back of a bottle. What does all this tell us if we step back? That value is a thing people manufacture, and a fragile one. Vanilla was not precious by nature. It became precious because for 300 years nobody except one people on one stretch of coast could make it bear fruit. And it stopped being precious not because it changed, but because first a boy found a gesture, and then two chemists found a molecule. Whatever seems irreplaceable holds exactly until the day someone works out how to do without it. And one more thing, harder. The world is very good at keeping the discovery and very bad at remembering the discoverer. A multi-billion-dollar industry rests on a movement of a thumb invented by a child who wasn't given a surname until he was 19. His method was copied within months. His name took a century to acknowledge. Look at how that injustice is built. It isn't that someone maliciously erased Edmond, though there were attempts. It's that the system is arranged so that the contribution of a person without standing has nowhere to be recorded. There's no patent because an enslaved person cannot hold property. There's no publication because he cannot write. There's no share because a share requires a contract, and a contract requires a party. His discovery instantly becomes nobody's, which is to say everybody's, which is to say somebody else's. And that is the sentence that connects him to the old man in Virginia with whom we began. One of them wrote about the rights of man and could not buy a spice. The other had no rights at all and gave the world that spice for nothing. History remembers the first one's handwriting and took 100 years to carve the second one's name. Think about that the next time you open a cupboard and reach for that small brown bottle. Think about the orchid that flowers for one morning a year. Think about the fact that every genuine pod on Earth has been fertilized by a human hand, one flower at a time, and that a single kilogram takes tens of thousands of those hands. Think about someone nameless in the forests of Veracruz who first worked out that a green pod must be tormented for months before it becomes itself. And think about a boy in a patched shirt who one morning showed his owner 2 green pods and said he had done it himself. Next time you pick up that bottle, hold it for a second and turn it around. Read the label. If it says vanillin or imitation or artificial, you're holding a molecule made from pine bark, paper waste, and petroleum that beat an entire plant. If it says pure vanilla extract, you're holding a federally defined quantity of 3 years of waiting, 1 morning of flowering, 9 months of ripening, in someone else's labor that is almost never paid for fairly. Both of those deserve more attention than we usually give them. If you made it this far, subscribe and tell me in the comments which part surprised you most: that vanilla has no smell until it's processed, that the whole world still pollinates it by hand, or that the boy who figured out how died with nothing. We've got a lot more stories like this one ahead.